nuclear terrorism is the only thing which is still not taken place. And therefore, it is not unthinkable because we are living in a rabid neighborhood. First, a few words about Dr. Rajagopalan. She is an expert on India's nuclear weapon policy, nuclear non-proliferation studies. Today, she'll be speaking to us on modeling nuclear terror strategy, likelihood, and countermeasures.
I'm happy to be here to speak on this important subject, as the chair mentioned. It's clearly one of the most important areas of concern for any country that looks at from a national security perspective. But we have not talked about it so much, as the chair mentioned, for two reasons. One, the primary reason, one reason the general already talked about. The second reason being that the atomic energy establishment within India have remained opaque or not willing to talk about it in an open manner. So even the lack of information to even Indian think tank or academic researchers to talk about some of these issues, to understand some of these issues. So the kind of work that has been undertaken in this area so far has by and large remained a theoretical exercise to say that, yeah, there could be terrorist threats, there could be various different forms and kinds of issues could come up and so on and so forth, but no real hardcore work has been done, substantive work has been done for a very long time. But finally, I think there is a little bit of limited amount of transparency, controlled transparency, effort being made by the atomic energy agencies as well as the security agencies within the country. And I think that's a very hopeful sign that there might be more studies coming up on the subject, which will also kind of create a better awareness among not only the security agencies, but also the first responder agencies in case of an emergency and so on and so forth. So clearly, the issue of nuclear terrorism has been around for a long time, particularly after the end of the Cold War. This issue became gained a somewhat a little bit of attention in the backdrop of how the Soviet Union weapons could land in the hands of nuclear terrorists or possibly terrorists and so on and so forth. But even then, the attention paid to the issue from a global point perspective was still minimal. The issue gained greater traction after the 9/11 terror attacks on the United States. So that was really the starting point in a big way where the global actors began to pay attention to the issue of nuclear terrorism in a big way. And there is the worry about its nuclear terror is very real. If you go by some of the numbers, for instance, in this regard, the IAEA has, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has a database called the Incident and Trafficking Database. Between January 1993 and December 2013, there were close to 2,500 incidents of theft and or unauthorized activities with regard to nuclear weapons, nuclear material. And I think that speaks louder. And these are the reported incidents that we are talking about in a sense. There could be a lot many more issues of theft and so on and so forth, and therefore you are looking at an issue which is pretty live, and every single security agency must be alive to this particular problem. But nevertheless, no terrorists so far have shown an inclination to possess or develop WMD. Again, but that does not give us the comfort or luxury to ignore or avoid this particular issue, because even if it is low probable, the high impact of this particular incident should keep us all awake at night in a sense. Why is it that the terrorists have not really pursued this particular WMD option, including chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear materials? Is it kind of a lack of wherewithal, the lack of financial, technical, and other capabilities? Or is it the lack of it's a political decision taken by, there could be or is it a combination of factors that have contributed to wherein you do not have terrorists pursuing nuclear weapons? I think it's also primarily this comes from the fact that it's a consequence of nuclear taboo, for instance. The United States used nuclear weapons in 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But since then, no country has ever thought about or contemplated on using nuclear weapons. There is an unestablished rule or a norm on non-use of nuclear weapons in a sense. And I think to some extent this taboo or the norm has also been in the minds of the non-state actors because the consequences are so large, so serious that I think there has been. So possibly the limitation comes from the fact that there is a non-written rule or norm about the non-use of nuclear weapons. That's possibly why. Again, like I said, this does not give us an assurance that no terrorist is going to pursue nuclear weapons in a sense. So what are the different ways of acquiring nuclear weapons in the first place? One could build, buy, or steal, or could even take control of a nuclear facility. There are different levels of difficulty associated with each of these processes when a terrorist wants to pursue. Even states that have wanted to develop nuclear weapon capability have had serious difficulties. The amount of, for instance, India is a good example, how we have, in the face of sanctions and so on and so forth in the post-1974 scenario, what kind of difficulties have we dealt with. But at the same time, states are, when they're talking about a full-fledged nuclear arsenal, and also there is a full-fledged infrastructure that you're talking about. But when looking at terrorists, they are looking at getting hold of a single weapon, and I think that may not be entirely difficult if they want to pursue it in a serious manner. And also, with the possibilities of, or with the existence of AQ-Khan-like networks, it's not an improbable scenario that we are looking at. But given the lethality of weapons, you have to look at protection of the nuclear facilities, whether it is civil nuclear facilities or weapon arsenal as the most important. And therefore, countries are focusing on developing, and these facilities are heavily guarded, for instance, protected with electronic locks, and most of the times, in the Indian case at least, is in a demated situation, making it difficult for an entire weapon, even if somebody is able to break into a particular facility and so on and so forth. But a full-fledged nuclear weapon does not have to be used. There could be other variants that might be considered, and these include, for instance, the use of radiological weapons, for instance, radiological dispersion device, the suitcase bomb, or attacking a nuclear facility hoping for the spreading of the radiological contamination and so on and so forth. And there were reports about, for instance, about the 9/11 attacks, that apparently Al-Qaeda initially planned to crash one of the passenger jets into one of the nuclear facility. So these are not scenarios that the terrorists have not really gone through in their heads a couple of different times, but they have not done it for a different variety of different reasons. So, like I said, is it the terrorists, is it the lack of capability, or is it the unwillingness for because of political issues? So when you look at some of the more established terrorist groups, Hamas, the LTT, for instance, LTT had a parallel government with a full-fledged army running. So why is it that some of these well-established groups who have all the technological, financial wherewithal, they did not pursue nuclear weapons? So many at the time, it's concluded that, many analysts conclude that this is because it could potentially hurt their political causes. The LTT, imagine the LTT trying to use nuclear weapons, even a suitcase bomb, they could potentially lose their social support, and the support among the popular support among the local population could be lost, and therefore even most established groups such as LTT never contemplated in acquiring or use of nuclear weapons. So it's more of political reasons than technological or financial capability that have prevented the groups, terrorists, from acquiring nuclear capabilities. But you have groups like Al-Qaeda or groups like ISIS, for instance, who are more apolitical in nature, who don't have their activities associated with a particular country or things of that kind. They're geographical spread out, and the fact that they are not rooted in within one particular country alone could give them a much more free hand in contemplating the use of such nuclear weapons, and be not exactly concerned about the consequences in that sense. So therefore, again, prevention, security, counter-response, these become key for any government when they talk about nuclear security. So what is the kind of nuclear terror threat that we have in India? You have multiple threats coming from the left-wing extremism to separatist insurgency to state-sponsored terrorism from across the border. There are also newer threats in terms of the insider threat, that's an insider colluding with an external party, and how that might play out in creating a situation. There are also terrorist groups who are showing much more capability in terms of, for instance, to take well-coordinated commando-style attacks. The Mumbai terrorist attacks was one case in point where the elite really put forward their best set of capabilities in a sense. And given the kind of neighborhood that we are in, there are unstable regimes in whether it is political failures or social and economic difficulties in the neighborhood, failing states, weak civilian leadership, weak civil-military relationship. All of this, in a sense, are complicating the complex security scenario for India in a big way. No attack on nuclear facilities so far in the case of India. And I think that's something that we did a study on nuclear security in India. Last year, we released the first edition of the report, before which we had extensive discussions with the atomic energy agencies, the Department of Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, otherwise, and also the state security agencies, state police, intelligence agencies, CISF, and all the different agencies. So one of the things the Atomic Energy agencies kept telling us was that, see, look at this. We still haven't had a single terrorist attack on any of our facilities. It's great that we haven't had, but Pathankot attack in the beginning of the year did show certain amount of vulnerabilities that exist on the Indian side, because this is supposed to be one of our most safeguarded, one of our frontline air bases. The fact that we did have an attack within the air base did show that there could be vulnerabilities that could be utilized by terror groups and so on and so forth. And therefore, we cannot take comfort in saying that we haven't had an attack on. We don't have to wait for a precedent and then realize that these are the kind of threats that we have to be prepared to, in a sense. Threat in the neighborhood, India's neighborhood, like I said, Pakistan and Bangladesh are becoming serious problems. Growing number of radicals even in Bangladesh, which used to be at one point of time considered a moderate Islamic state. But even there, they are witness to a number of terrorist incidents. The amount of radicalization that is taking place is something that we have to be alive to, in a sense. And why are we talking about nuclear in a big way? Why are we looking at that? The current context is that nuclear power currently, for instance, contributes to 3.6% of India's total electricity generation and around 1.91% of the total energy mix. So, and following the US-India nuclear deal and the NSG waiver in 2008, the nuclear sector within India is likely to grow in a big way, contributing to a larger, the need of the country to have a larger energy mix, in a sense. So we are looking at every single energy option, including nuclear energy, to contribute in a big way to our programs. So which means that one is that the sector is likely to grow, but it's also possible that we will possibly have the larger private sector participation. Again, how do you bring the private sector participation, and how do you essentially ensure compliance of the rules and regulations in this particular regard to ensure nuclear security at even private sector run facilities and so on and so forth. Again, these are things that we need to kind of study and come out with various measures. So, like I said, the point that we need to focus on is to prevent, detect, and effectively respond. These are the three key things that we need to focus when we talk about nuclear security. So MEA, for instance, Ministry of External Affairs, prior to one of the nuclear security summits, they came out with a nuclear security in India, a booklet, which talked about what are the 5 components that govern the nuclear security policy in India. They talked about governance, nuclear security practice and culture, institutions, technology, and international cooperation. All of these 5 are key in enabling a full-fledged and efficient structure, institutional and legal, and a policy structure in place to tackle this particular problem. So we have a set of regulations that came about in the 1960s and 70s. The Indian Atomic Energy Act of 1962 is the umbrella legislation that governs, which encompasses the entire nuclear security within India. It provides a legal basis for the development, control, and use of nuclear energy in India. Since then, these rules and regulations have undergone changes, revisions, amendments, taking into account newer set of concerns, newer threats, and so on and so forth. And also there are a whole host of legislation pertaining to the environmental issues, for instance. And some of the critical ones in this regard are the Environment Protection Act 1986, the Atomic Energy Facilities Rules 1996, the Electricity Act of 2003. We also have, the DAE has also formulated guidelines for nuclear transfers and exports, for instance, in 2006. We have the Atomic and WMD Act in 2005. So there have been a series of measures in terms of the legislative framework that we have put into place, which gives a lot of a responsibility to, for instance, to the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, which is the nuclear reviewer or the auditor for the nuclear facility, the DAE-run nuclear facilities in India. We have also been updating our control list, the export control list, through which you control the export and import of materials, nuclear as well as other materials, between various countries. The control list and related regulations, again, have been updated constantly, especially in the backdrop of India trying to get a membership into the nuclear suppliers group. So there have been multiple levels of efforts being made by the Indian government to secure, because even before, much before the 9/11 happened, we have been victim of terrorism. And this is something that has constantly fed into our security, as part of our security culture. We may not have formalized in as many words, but the fact is that this has been something that India has been conscious of for a very long time. But again, we can't have complacency in this particular area. One of the bills, for instance, is one of the criticism in that sense, which I'll come to in a little later. It has been about the nature of the regulator or the auditor. That is the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board. How independent, how autonomous is the Atomic Energy Regulator? That's been one of the critical areas of within the country as well as the global nuclear community have talked about when they talk about India's nuclear security in a sense. So we did try to come up with a new bill called the NSRA, the Nuclear Safety Regulatory Authority Bill in 2011, but it was languishing in the parliament for a long time. And 2014 came, we went into the election cycle, so the bill has lapsed. It now needs to be reintroduced in the parliament. That's something I'll come back to. But while the NSRA is a big improvement of the current AERB structure, even then there are issues with the NSRA. There have been criticism about how, does the autonomy come out clearly in the new NSRA form that is going to replace the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board. But the IAEA, for instance, there was the government of India had invited an IAEA team to come to India to study some of the nuclear security safety and security practices. So there was a integrated regulatory review services mission undertaken on the AERB in March 2015, last year. So the mission came out with a report which noted that the AERB functions independently without any interference from the other nuclear entities of the country. The report nevertheless recommended that there could be a de facto independence of the regulator, and that could be cemented into in a law that completely separates out the DAE from the AERB. Because today, the DAE, the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, AERB, gets their financial, technical, and administrative support from the DAE, which is the promoter of nuclear energy. So there is a direct conflict of interest. So it may be true that we haven't had a catastrophic incident because of the lack of compliance ensured by the AERB on DAE-run facilities, but we should not be waiting for a Fukushima-like crisis to happen in what happened in Japan, to happen in India, and then realize that we should have had a full-fledged nuclear regulator in place. So that's one particular issue to be considered. Some of the other important measures that I want to highlight in the Indian context is, one is nuclear security culture and practice. Because one can have the best of technology, best of legal institutional mechanism, but it depends on the personnel within the facility in implementing them. So a good policy is 20% technology and 80% human. because that human element is something so important, especially in the recent years, with the insider threat becoming a much larger problem that India or even all the major powers have to deal with in this regard. So to tackle this particular problem of insider threat, India has something called the Personal Reliability Program or the Human Reliability Program, which is being prescribed by the IAEA. And this has been one of the best programs run by the DAE in conjunction with the state police and others, and intelligence bureau with the intel agency. So this has been one of the best run things. But one of the bigger problems with India is that we do not talk about our own accomplishments, our own successes, our own policy. So not even outlining a broad policy in the open has actually gone to hurt our interests much more than advance our case in a sense. So even as part of the study, we were traveling in France to understand their practices. And France is one country that India has worked very closely when it comes to nuclear safety issues. But talking to many of the officials, they had no clue that India had instituted something called the Personal Reliability Program. And this has been a long-running program, very successfully done, wherein you verify a particular person's background in terms of the family background, the medical background, whether the person has a social background in terms of whether he's an alcoholic, drug addict. And this is done for like 6 to 8 months. This exercise is done before a person is taken in a particular facility. And thereafter, the reviews are further done every 2 years, or as and when the person has to is cleared for a higher security facility, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the most important programs. And second, one important aspect is the design and safety and security that we have inculcated within our premises, which is that you have a national level as well as a plant level DBT, design basis threat, that is a document that is formulated at the time of when you're setting up a power plant. But even after that, for instance, the DBTs constantly undergo review. Now, post Pathankot, again, the DBTs have been reviewed to undertake, to see where we are lacking, what are the fresh vulnerabilities that we are facing, and so on and so forth. I had a discussion with some of the DA officials just last month. So this is one. Second is the availability of materials. And I think that's one area where we have seen certain amount of weaknesses. Weaknesses come from the incident in Mayapuri, the Delhi University, involving Delhi University, the chemistry department, where they disposed of the cobalt-60 without even realizing what they were disposing of. And it finally landed with a scrap dealer, and who had no idea. And so he looked at it, nice shining thing, he put it on his pocket and walked around. Towards the evening, he began to fall ill, but it also brought to the front one another area of weakness, the ability or the capability of the first responders, the medical community. How quickly were the AIIMS or the submerging air doctors able to detect what they were dealing with? They did not. Finally, one of the doctors from the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, had to personally intervene to say that this is the problem, this is how. But given the kind of contamination that he was already exposed to, he died. But that's, again, the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board is supposed to maintain an inventory, and again, how effectively they are doing is a serious problem. And I'm going to stop here. I think I'm going to leave it here and then take up more during the questions. Thank you.